Welcome to the Ashraf Garda show. Jeremy Sampson, let's talk marketing wars. Welcome to the show.
Always good to be with you, Ashraf.
Thank you. Now, I tell you what, I'm talking to you because you put together a piece called Rands for Brands in relation to M&As or mergers and acquisitions, which I found particularly interesting. So perhaps, first of all, give me the broad level synopsis. What did you say?
Well, basically, there's a very eminent lawyer in this country, Mr. Michael Katz, who heads up ENS, Edward Nathan Sonnenberg, and he's been writing a fascinating series for the Financial Mail, which is headed up, in my opinion. I think he's now written 3 or 4 columns, and one of the columns was on mergers and acquisitions, and saying how, of course, for accountants and for lawyers, it was almost saying, in effect, good business because you need to make sure of what you're doing. I then said to the editor, Rob Rose, hang on, I'd like to respond to him through my lens of being a brander, because I know that if you went back 30 years or so, if you looked at the value of most companies, their market cap, in other words, their shares and the share price, you would have found that something like 10-20% was the so-called intangibles, which includes brands, and 80% would be, say, the factories or the machinery or the buildings and that sort of thing. Well, that was 30 years ago. Today, it's swung right around, that often if you look at a major company, their brands make up, well, they're the major assets of the company. And other intangibles, because it's not just brands, of course, patents, copyrights, and things like that, your intellectual capital, as it were. And it's very interesting that getting data from Brand Finance, which we're getting all the time, looking at the most valuable brand at the moment as we speak, which is Amazon, of its market cap, the brand is 24% of its market cap. Now that is a huge figure. That's billions and billions of dollars. So I thought, right, let's write a response and point out to people that brands have a role to play, that you must have a due diligence that includes the brands and the other IP. And then I gave a couple of examples of things that could go wrong. And you would remember, you're smiling, how the Rolls-Royce was the example I used, which is perhaps one of the best known. And just for your viewers, Rolls-Royce, of course, British company, started in the early 1900s, engineering. The biggest area of activity is aerospace engines, and to this day they supply Boeing and Airbus. But along the way they've had some rocky times. They've almost gone bankrupt, and they've been bailed out by the British government from time to time, and as we speak, because Airbus and Boeing have cut right back. But along the way they set up a little division called an automotive, and within that automotive division they had 2 little brands. One of them was, as they focused more and more on engineering, they realized that they weren't really in the car business, so they better sell off the businesses and put some cash in the bank, and how they were approached by both BMW and Volkswagen. Eventually they sold to Volkswagen, but when Volkswagen bought the whole thing, they didn't realize that they hadn't bought the trademarks. The trademarks were still owned by the parent company, Rolls-Royce. So there they'd got the factory, they'd got the workforce, an English workforce heavily unionized, which wasn't a good idea perhaps 30 years ago. And so then they started scrapping for the trademark. And then BMW got involved as well, because they still were interested. And how when the dust finally settled, and it did take a few years for it to settle, you have now a Rolls-Royce owned by, it's BMW, I must get this right, and a Bentley owned by Volkswagen. And that's where they stand. But it's very interesting that there wasn't a proper due diligence of the trademarks. And as you and I know, if you don't own the trademark, you don't own the brand. It's as simple as that.
I mean, that is fascinating. But let's just turn this around from the owners at that stage of of Rolls-Royce and Bentley, were they effectively involved in some degrees of mischief making when the deal happened, when they sold? Would you have a sense that they were fully aware that the new owners were not buying the trademarks, which means in fact they were buying the know-how, but they were not buying what the public identified? Would you know?
Well, that's one of the big mysteries, because why would you buy anything? I think it's because historically, perhaps going way, way back, as I say, it's a company that's been around 120 years or so. This was an arrangement that had been put in place many years ago, and perhaps it was just an oversight. But it is interesting that when you look at an acquisition, who owns the trademark? Where is it? Where is it domiciled? Now, of course, is a challenge for any company. Where do you house your brands, if I can put it that way? Because in this world where people pay the big boys, like the Amazons and the Googles, are looking at the financial engineering to reduce their tax levels. Where are they domiciled? Often they're domiciling trademarks in offshore positions. And that could be somewhere exotic, like the Virgin Islands or other places similar. Or it can be even in Ireland, where in the Irish Republic, there are advantages from the tax aspect. And closer to home, of course, if you housed your trademarks in somewhere like Mauritius, your tax angles would reduce dramatically. And this is where sometimes at Brand Finance we get involved, helping with the financial engineering. I know the founder of Brand Finance, David Haig, has actually been involved in some legal cases where he's been pulled in by the receiver of revenue in the UK or by the IRS in the States to give his opinion on what's been going on with the trademarks.
Okay, so that's a great example. So it's possible even the seller were not involved in mischief making. It's an oversight on their side, but the bigger responsibility, from where I understand you sitting, is that the buyers had to do the due diligence, and they had to understand that there's an intrinsic value in the trademark, and if they were not buying the trademark, they were buying nothing. Okay, so big lesson there. Well, you also gave other examples, right? Share those examples.
Well, the other example was bringing us right up to date, where I think if I had said to you, Ashraf, in the beginning of January, have you ever had a webinar on Zoom or Teams? And you'd have said, no, Jeremy, everything is on Skype. And I think that's where most of us were. But today, here we are in July, where suddenly we become conscious of all this. And one of the main ones has been Zoom. But it's very interesting that as things changed from the end of February, people looked on the, I think it was the New York Stock Exchange, but it was in New York, and they saw Zoom and they thought, this stock is going to take off. Everyone's plugging into it because we're having conference calls, we're all being told to stay at home and self-isolate, etc. So punters started piling into the share price of Zoom. And in the month of March, it went up 3 times. Only it was the wrong Zoom.
Wow.
There's a Zoom Technologies, and they were going into Zoom Technologies, but there was Zoom video conferencing, and they missed that. So whilst the Zoom Technologies went up 3 times, Zoom video went up, I think, 30%. And then the administrators of the stock exchange and the SEC realized what was going on, and they suspended Zoom technology. So, that's 3 months ago.
Wow.
And it just shows you how, if you have a brand or you have a name, is it registered? Who owns it? And are you working with the right one? I'm sure we've all had examples sometimes that you're using a name or terminology and you're realizing the person you're having the conversation with is using the same name or the same terminology, but they're thinking totally differently to you. And that's where I've certainly been in meetings where if you're talking in branding terms, something like brand architecture, you suddenly say, look, hang on, stop. What's your definition of brand architecture? Because it's obviously not the same as mine. And then once you're back on the same page together, you can work together. But I think sometimes people are worried about actually interrupting a conversation. But you can go off at a tangent in the wrong direction, and that can get very dangerous, to the point where at Rolls-Royce, obviously they had very expensive advice from the legal side, from the financial side, working in Germany and working in England and comparing notes, but they still missed who owned the trademark.
Yeah, wow. Well, let me push back on this one. I have my own fascinating story, which is a good time to talk about. When I hosted a show on SAFM, I was set up to interview a person, right? And this is and I'll give you the name just now, very well-known business person, very successful at the time, and that's the name given to me, and all my research ahead of the interview was based upon that person. However, with 30 seconds as we're about to go on the air, and we then double-check titles, I then realized for the first time that actually we were not talking to him, we were going to talk to his son, who has the same name as the father, and that wasn't a shortcoming on my side. It was given to me by my producer up front, because the producer didn't know that in fact there were two Alan, not Craig. So there's a story for you, okay? He didn't know. I knew that up front. If I knew that, I would have obviously responded differently. But as a result, and Alan, not Craig Jr. will now know for the first time that when I interviewed him a few years ago, all the preparation was to speak to his father, the founder of Vodacom. And that's a different story, and there's a good example of that.
Well, yes, instead of talking about Vodacom, you had to talk about Hero.
Well, there you are. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's then look at the due diligence part. You've made the point. What response did you get when you put out the article? Because I understand you did get some serious traction around it.
I think a lot of people, we put it as usual on LinkedIn, and suddenly it was on Twitter as well, and a lot of people commented on it, and the response level was huge, because I think a lot of people have forgotten that, or didn't realize, that brands, if they are separable, and that's a key thing, you must be able to separate the brand out from the company who owns it, can be bought and sold for huge amounts of money. So in that article, for instance, I illustrated the fact by saying, well, do you really know who owns Volvo today? And who cares? Because it's the Chinese. Or a Jaguar and a Land Rover owned by Tata, the Indian company. And this is where lots of examples today of brands owned by different people, but the brand, of course, has got to stay true to its DNA. Otherwise, people won't like it anymore. So this is where a lot of owners will buy up a brand, because it's much quicker to buy a brand than create your own. In any case, if you try and create your own, you might not be successful. So rather try and buy a brand, and then you can reinvigorate it with your financial support. The Chinese went into laptop technology of computers when they bought IBM's laptop division, and they rebranded it Lenovo, but they migrated the goodwill from IBM through to the Lenovo. And this is where brands can be bought and sold for a lot of money. And as we speak, in these very difficult times, there are companies who perhaps want to offload some brands. They want to change the focus of the company. And there are some people who are desperate for money, so they'll sell off their brands. So we're expecting more and more around the world there to be more buying and selling of brands going on. In South Africa, we haven't seen much, but I guess we can all think of the Edgar's Group, Edcon, who've just sold Jet, and Jet has gone into the Foschini Group, TFG. I still have trouble with TFG, but anyway, that's another issue. And I believe that one of the key issues in the negotiations, which went on quite some time, was how separable the Jet brand was from the Edgar's Group. Because when you think of the logistics, the distribution center, the financial systems, credit, etc., it's quite a job to separate out one brand from an organization. And now, of course, it has the issue of being accepted and pulled into the Foschini Group systems. But there is a local example, and I think we expect to see some more happening down the line.
All right, and lastly, you started by talking about typical bricks and mortar assets, and office equipment, laptops. I mean, and maybe goods, right? But brands mean something else. So this is a space certainly from where you are at Brand Finance. What is a brand, and how do you put a value to a brand?
Interesting question, because we sometimes ignore that. No, a brand is something that is trademarked, that then creates a promise, and it's the sort of thing that if, for instance, let's be basic and say your favorite toothpaste is, should we say, Colgate. That brand, Colgate, is something that you trust. After all, you put it in your mouth a couple of times a day, probably. It's something that is reliable. It is something that is consistent, and it does what you want it to do. And that's basically what a brand has got to be about. It's got to be a promise made and a promise kept, and therefore you want to make sure that it's totally consistent, but totally relevant at all times. That means that any brand has got to stay relevant to its market sectors. And as you know, in marketing terms, you talk about marketing segments. Is it the under 20s, and you can go up by decade right up to 75 plus? Who does your brand appeal to? The other aspect, of course, is keeping your brand relevant. You don't want a brand that appeals to older people and not younger people. Now, we often talk about brands today which are male brand or female brand or transgender brands. We talk of a brand like Dove, part of the Unilever stable, and Dove appeals to male and female, young and old. And that's the sort of sweet spot you want your brand to be in. But at all times, a brand is something that is distinctive and stands out from the clutter. Again, if you go into your supermarket and you see an array of, 20 different brands of this or that, you want your brand to stand out, be distinctive, and the one that if you can't buy it, in fact, because it's not available, you actually walk out of the shop and go somewhere where it is available. Now, that sort of brand loyalty is increasingly rare, but from a marketer to actually have a stint in their lives of working on a major brand is a huge responsibility. If you take MTN, currently the CMO there is Bernice Samuels, who has huge experience from her time previously at MTN and FNB and SAB Anheuser-Busch. But she's responsible and her team for a brand that is arguably worth over 50 billion rands. And that's the responsibility of the marketing department. And when the rest of the executive realize that there's one person and one team looking after an asset of 50 billion rands, it changes the conversation. That person should be sitting on the exco. If she does, I don't know. But they have to be involved with the major decisions, and they have to be there all along. And then with the financial director, of course, he wants a brand that will be consistent. It's in demand all the time. It has loyal customers, and therefore that brand is fairly consistent. It might be slightly seasonal, you don't know, but he wants that consistency of cash flow. And then you have the argument from the marketing department to the financial department saying, we need money from you to invest in keeping our brand relevant and keeping on staying strong and beating out the competition. And that's where we at Brand Finance talk about bridging the gap between marketing and finance, so that both sides realize that for the good of the company, you've got to have strong brands, you've got to keep them strong, and they've got to stay relevant. Otherwise, you ain't got a business.
I remember chatting to Sizakele Marudlule a while back, and she made the point that a drink is only a drink that looks blackish, brownish, is only a drink until it's named Coca-Cola. Then it becomes the brand, right? Which gets me to put this point to you that so historically, brands would not be considered part of stock in trade. It would mean the actual drink, right? How then do you determine the value of the brand?
Well, this is where from nearly 25 years ago, David Haig started Brand Finance. He and I both worked together at Interbrand, and using different methodologies for establishing a value, and following the international standards way of doing evaluation. You look at the financials of a brand. Now you want to know that it's been a strong brand around for perhaps 4 or 5 years. You want to look at the projection figures of that brand going forward. And so you have a financial side to the whole thing. And then you have more of a perceptual, reputational side, which we call the brand strength, where we will often look at about 100 touch points of a brand to see again how it's perceived and understood. And you put all that together, and it's done in a totally transparent way, and you establish an actual value. It's interesting that about 3 or 4 years ago, the top brand was Apple, and then Apple was knocked off its perch, I think, by Amazon, or it might have been Google at the time. One of the reasons was a lot of people were saying Apple didn't have a future. I'm sure you can remember those discussions where people said, oh, you've got something new, but what's coming out next year, or what's coming out the year after? And Apple basically said, well, we don't need to bring out anything new. You know, this is where we're going very strongly with what we've got. And it's interesting that just this morning I saw the financial results for the iPad coming out of China for Q2, and they're up over, the sales are up over 25% in 1 quarter in China. And that shows you that that brand is very strong. That enhances its brand value as well. And some people say, well, no, you dream up the value. But we say, no, we don't dream up the value. We're establishing it based on the data you're giving us from the financial side, as I say, from the brand strength side. And often based on that, you have brands bought and sold, or you have licensing agreements. Now, before we were on air, we were talking about football brands, and this is where those football brands can license the use of the brand on shirts and other things, and that's often based on the value of the brand. And that informs the discussion they have with people like the sponsors, like the Adidases and the Nikes and the Umbros and the Under Armour. What is your brand worth? What is its value? How are we going to license it? So all these things come down to, yes, putting it all together, but coming down to actually a hard financial figure.
And therefore, the number one brand in the world, according to Brand Finances?
The number one brand in the world at the moment is Amazon. And you know, when we talk about COVID-19 and who has benefited, Amazon certainly was very relevant because of home deliveries and that sort of thing. And we say that Amazon has huge runway as well. It's not one of those things where you're going to say, where's it going to be in 2, 3, 4 years' time? You can see it's very, very strong. And then the Googles, well, let's take a step back. They call them the FANGs, don't they? You know, F for Facebook, A for Amazon, or is it Alphabet, and N for Netflix, G for Google, and you know, add in Microsoft to the FANGs. And there are the top brands, which are largely technology brands. But that's where there's an interesting debate at the moment, because one of the fastest growing brands in the world is Tesla. And people are saying, well, is Tesla an automotive company that dabbles in technology, or is it really a technology company that's produced something on 4 wheels? And no, this is where we're finding, as the world evolves, things are fascinating. Some of the labels and some of the ways we thought of things, as I said earlier, only 3 months ago, are already perhaps a little bit out of date.
That's why they call you the brand daddy. Jeremy Sampson, thank you for your time.